Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment and ask that you check me out on Patreon at www.patreon.com/CanadaEHX. There are several tiers with great benefits, from ad-free content to t-shirts and other cool stuff. And if you're a fan of Canadian History X, make sure you check out my other shows, From John to Justin and Canada, A Yearly Journey. And don't forget, you can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com. It helps keep this show going. All right, on with the show. It is the spookiest time of the year, when ghouls and goblins come out of the shadows to spread a bit of fear. It's when we curl up on the couch to watch a scary movie or dress up for a costume party. And in a country as large as Canada, with a long history and many cultures, there are many spooky tales. From ghosts who haunt buildings, to creatures that paralyze you while you sleep, to a valley that can leave you headless. I'm Craig Baird, this is Canadian History X, and let's turn down the lights and delve into the world of the unexplained with Canada's spooky mysteries. You're laying in bed. The wind outside is slowly lulling you to sleep. But as you close your eyes, you hear your door creak open. You think, it's nothing, just the house settling. The floorboards groan under an unknown weight. You open your eyes, and you see her. An old woman with dark eyes and hair matted and long over her shoulders. Her fingers are bony with fingernails that look more like claws. You know immediately who it is. The Old Hag of Newfoundland. You try to move, but you can't. Your body is paralyzed. She walks to the front of your bed and slowly begins to climb it. As she sits down on top of you, you can't open your mouth, and you choke on a scream. And then, just as soon as she appears, she's gone. And the room is quiet. For people in Newfoundland, the Old Hag has become such a part of the culture that her name is a verb among islanders. After seeing the hag, people will say, "I was hagged last night," or "I got hag-ridden." While the story of the Old Hag was first published in the Journal of American Folklore in the 1890s, her tales on the island go back much farther. The stories vary. Some say she sits on your chest, others claim she will whisper sinister things into your ear and curse you. Thankfully, though, there are things you can do to ward her off. You can recite the Lord's Prayer or sleep on your back with a board of upright nails on your chest. Although, that one seems more dangerous and uncomfortable than a visit by the Old Hag. You can place scissors under your pillow or hang a red ribbon above your bed. Or do nothing at all, because there's actually a scientific explanation for the Old Hag experience. It's called sleep paralysis. You know, when you wake up, but you're unable to move because of muscle atonia in REM sleep. When you sleep, our brains lock down our muscles so we don't act out our dreams, which does happen and is extremely dangerous. Just search comedian Mike Birbigilia's special Sleepwalk with Me. But sometimes we wake up before the brain has restarted the muscle engines, and that is called sleep paralysis. Of course, a scientific explanation doesn't make a visit from the Old Hag of Newfoundland any less terrifying. So if you dare take a trip to the Rock, bring a red ribbon with you, just in case. For our next tale, we're going to travel north to the Canadian Arctic, where in 1853, Augustus Richard Piers was a young man of 33 working as a fur trader and postmaster at Fort McPherson. Located 1,100 kilometers northwest of Yellowknife, the fort was originally built by John Bell in 1840, several kilometers from its current location, and was an important trading post in the Mackenzie Delta region for the Hudson's Bay Company. Pierce lived at that location when he suddenly fell seriously ill. Knowing his end was near, he told those around him that he did not want to be buried at Fort McPherson and begged to be taken 800 kilometers south to Fort Simpson. Pierce died soon after, but no one took his body to his preferred burial site. For 6 years, Piers waited to be laid to rest where he wanted until Roderick McFarlane came along. Born in 1833, he joined the Hudson's Bay Company in 1852, and a year later was put in charge of Fort Ray near Great Slave Lake. He moved between forts until he was sent to Fort McPherson, where he heard Piers's story and he decided to fulfill his final wishes. With an unnamed companion, he set off on a long journey south, using sled dogs for quick travel. They glided over the glacial landscape next to the Mackenzie River as the aurora borealis danced above their heads. Every time they stopped to rest, wild animals approached the sled where Piers was kept. As the animals stepped closer, a mysterious voice bellowed for the sled dogs to run. McFarlane and his companion would quickly hop onto the sled to begin the journey once again. Both men believed it was Piers's ghostly voice urging the dogs to continue so he did not become food for wild animals. After the men reached Fort Simpson and buried Piers, they were able to lay their heads down for their first good night's sleep in weeks. But Piers wasn't done with them quite yet. As McFarlane tried to fall asleep in his bed, Piers suddenly appeared in his room, leaving McFarlane terrified. He wrote that he covered my face with the blanket and remained speechless. Maybe Piers just wanted to say thank you, or perhaps he was a bit mad that it took 6 years for him to finally be laid to rest in Fort Simpson. Either way, this was the tale of Augustus Piers, the Mackenzie River Ghost. Follow me now as we take a trip along another river. This time, it's the Ottawa River to Clarendon, Ontario, to George Daggs's home, where he lived with his wife Susan, their daughters Eliza and Mary, baby John, and Dina McLean, their adopted child from Scotland. In the summer of 1889, the family woke up to find animal dung smeared along the floor of their farmhouse. When Dagg asked the children if they had done it, they all said they had not. He suspected a local boy known for causing trouble, but it turned out he wasn't in the area when the incident occurred. It was strange to say the least, but Dagg put the incident out of his mind. Unfortunately, things were about to escalate. Over the coming days, fires spontaneously erupted inside and outside the house. At one point, 8 fires were burning in a single day. Even going to sleep didn't give the family any sort of respite. Stones began to fly through the windows while water in cream jugs, water basins, and other items were thrown around the house at night. Everyone was beginning to suspect that what they were dealing with was a supernatural entity, what some may call a poltergeist. It also seemed that the young Scottish lass Dina was the focus of the paranormal activity. The family reportedly saw her out in the woodshed having a conversation with an unseen person, and as time went on, the spirit became more abusive, hitting and scratching Dina. But then, things started to change. As news of the angry spirit spread, people began to show up to see the spectacle for themselves. Obviously delighted with the attention, the poltergeist went from diva to delight in front of the crowds. One witness said, "When the child Dina was present, a deep gruff voice like that of an aged man has been heard at various times, both in the house and outdoors, and when asked questions, it answered so as to be distinctly heard." Some claim that Dina was the cause of everything and a skilled ventriloquist, capable of casting her voice to other parts of the room. Whether it was Dina or something else, the growing fame brought reporters to the family home, including one that got into a long debate with the spirit. The reporter, Percy Woodcock, debated philosophy, theology, and morality with the unseen entity. But the apparition still had an angry streak. If it became enraged or angry during the debate, it would slap, kick, and punch Dina. Eventually, Woodcock stopped asking questions. Depending on who the spirit was talking to, it would claim to be the devil, telling Dina that she was forever in his clutches, or that it was the ghost of a man who had died 20 years earlier. Then, one day, just as quickly as the activity had started, it stopped. According to witnesses, the spirit was talking in a demonic voice that suddenly became angelic, and the sound of hymns could be heard. From that point on, there was no more poltergeist activity in the home of the Dagg family, and they returned to something resembling normalcy. As for Dina, she seemed to disappear from history at this point. There are stories of her working on a different farm as a teen. Then one day, a mysterious man called on her one night, and she was never seen again. As for whether or not the poltergeist was Dina, who caused all those disruptions, we'll never truly know. The story of the Dag poltergeist isn't the only one in southern Ontario. The Baldoon mystery is centered on the present-day site of Wallaceburg, Ontario, and the story begins way back in 1804. It was in that year when 15 families of Scottish immigrants settled in the area. The families hoped to build better lives for themselves in their new home. Unfortunately, that was far from the case. The settlers dealt with harsh winters, marshland unsuitable for farming, a lack of food, and American soldiers destroying their homes during the War of 1812. By the early 1820s, the settlement was considered to be a failure. But that didn't stop settlers from trying to make a life for themselves in their new home. The McDonalds had arrived in the early 1820s and bought land from an old woman who lived in the area. By 1829, the family was firmly established. Unfortunately, things were about to change. One day, while the family was preparing straw for the animals in their barn, the roof collapsed. Everyone quickly ran for cover and thankfully escaped injury. At night, as the family tried to sleep, they could hear the footsteps of men walking in unison like soldiers. Every time they investigated the noise, it stopped. A few weeks later, the family was gathered in the living room when the cradle holding their baby began to rock violently. The family rushed over and grabbed the cradle, but no matter of how hard they tried, they could not stop the rocking. They quickly grabbed the baby and stood back from the violently rocking cradle. Fires randomly began around the property with no clear sign of ignition. When the family put out one, another started. You may be seeing some similarities with the Dag poltergeist and the love of starting fires. That isn't the only similarity, though. At night, rocks and bullets went through the windows, terrifying the family, just like with the Dag poltergeist. The family took the rocks and bullets, marked them, and then threw them into the river. When the rocks and bullets started going through the windows again, they carried the same marks left by the family. Eventually, the family just boarded up their windows. That didn't stop the paranormal activity, though. The sound of bullets and rocks thudding against the boards continued all night. Not knowing what to do, the family asked a local preacher to come and bless the home. It didn't help. They next asked a ghost hunter to rid their home of whatever was tormenting them, but again, it didn't stop. With no other options left to them, the family contacted Dr. John Troyner. It was said locally that his daughter was a seer with second sight, and when they talked to her, they were told that someone had put a curse on their land. The McDonalds immediately believed that the curse came from the old woman who had sold them their land, which eventually devolved into a land dispute over money. The seer told them the woman was a shapeshifter, and if they saw a black goose on the property, they were to shoot it immediately. A few days later, a black goose appeared and was shot in the wing. When the family saw the old woman again, her arm was in a sling. From that point on, the tormenting of the family ended, and the family finally found peace on their property. Maybe it's something in the air in southern Ontario that brings out the poltergeists who go bump in the night. Next in our petrifying pursuit of the paranormal, we traveled to the Miramichi River Valley of New Brunswick. Located in the territory of the Micmac people, the area has huge forests that have been harvested for centuries. At some point in the 19th century, a young man named Ryan went to work on a lumber camp near the Dungarvan River to work as a cook. As he arrived in the camp, he brought with him everything he owned. It wasn't much, just the clothes on his back and a money belt with coins and large bills fastened around his waist. While he never told anyone at camp where the money came from, he made no secret that he had it. Described as tall, handsome, with black curly hair, he was well liked, as he was known to whoop and holler better than anyone in the camp. For the woodsmen, where entertainment was in short supply, the ability to whoop was highly valued. Each morning, Ryan got out of bed as the sun rose to prepare breakfast. When everything was ready, he let out a loud whoop to call everyone to eat. Once the lumbermen enjoyed a fantastic breakfast, they left to harvest the forest, and Ryan was by himself to clean and prepare meals for the day. One day, the camp boss stayed behind. This was unusual, but no one questioned his decision. When the men returned for lunch, something was different. The kitchen was quiet, and the wafting smells of a delicious meal was absent. When they investigated, they found Ryan dead on the floor, His money belt, which everyone knew he always had on him, was missing. The men asked the boss what had happened, and he told him he got sick suddenly and died. They were suspicious, but they didn't question the matter any further. The plan was to take the young man's body back to the nearest town so he could be given a proper burial. That night, as the men carried the body out of camp, a great storm swept in. The wind shook the trees as torrential rain fell. The men couldn't go any further and made the decision to bury Ryan in a shallow grave in the forest. And as they walked back to the camp in the storm, between the thunder that shook the air, something else was heard. The men stopped in their tracks, wondering they heard what they thought they had. Then, whoop! There was no mistaking it. In the darkness of the trees and the power of the storm came the sound of someone whooping in the shadows. The men raced back to camp and into their bunks, but all night they heard it. Whoop! And as soon as the sun came up, the terrified men packed up and fled the camp, never to return. For years, anyone walking in the forest near where Ryan was buried would hear something whooping in the trees. One day, Father Edward Murdoch visited the area, read the Bible, and made the sign of the cross. Some sources state that he performed an exorcism at Ryan's gravesite. Whatever he did, from then on, Ryan's whooping was not to be heard. But the whooping sound was not gone forever. When the first train traveled past the Dungarvan area years later, it blasted its whistle. As the sound echoed through the hills, locals said it sounded like a man whooping. Thus the train became known as the Dungarvan Whooper. Speaking of trains, let's take a trip out to St. Louis in central Saskatchewan, which was once serviced by the railroad, but as the automobile took over, the trains disappeared and the track was torn up. But the train that went through St. Louis may not have disappeared completely. Known as the St. Louis train or St. Louis ghost light, locals say that some nights you can see the train's headlights still moving along the vanished track. Ghost trains are nothing unusual when it comes to spooky stories. They can be found elsewhere in Canada, the United States, Europe, and Japan. One tale tells of a brakeman who was walking along the track, possibly drunk, when he was decapitated by a passing train. Now he walks the track, holding a lantern, looking for his head once more. There may be an explanation for the ghost train, though. Through the autumn of 2001 and the winter of 2002, two grade 12 students out of La Ronge, Saskatchewan, named Alicia and Shannon, began to study the stories of the ghost train. Using a scale map, compass, and GPS, they calculated their location while viewing the lights from the old track bed. They drew a straight line from their location through the spot where the light originated and then marked all the roads on or near the line. The girls then had Alicia's father position his vehicle on the first spot on the map and turn on his headlights. They didn't get the results they were looking for due to the roads being too low to their position. But there was one more road to investigate, Highway 2, which was 8.5 kilometers away. Alicia's father took his car out to the highway, and along one stretch of road, as he turned on his headlights on and off, a light appeared closer to the girls that resembled the St. Louis ghost light. Through these tests, the girls determined that the St. Louis ghost train was likely caused by diffraction, where light passes through a small opening like distant trees and can be diffused and expanded in size. This caused car headlights in the distance to look closer and larger than they were. For their experiments, the girls won gold medals at a science fair, but residents aren't totally convinced. They say the lights predate the use of the automobile. Is the St. Louis ghost train just headlight diffraction from automobiles? Or is it a train that still runs on schedule long after it should have stopped? Or is it that headless brakeman? As with so many things in this episode, the true answer may never be known. If I had a nickel for every headless ghost story in Canada, I would have 2 nickels. It isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. For our next spooky tale, we're going to New Brunswick for the story of Sister Mary Inconnu. In the late 1750s, she was a nun working in French Fort Cove. After helping a local woman with a difficult childbirth, she began to walk home when she was confronted. There are 2 versions of who confronted her. One version stated it was a mad trapper who attacked and murdered the nun. The second version, she came across 2 British sailors who asked her about a buried treasure. When she told them she didn't know about any treasure, she was murdered. At the time the story is set, the Acadian expulsion was taking place. This involved the British forcefully removing 11,500 Acadians from their lands in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and of those 5,000 died of disease, starvation, and shipwrecks. Fearing being attacked, many Acadians took their valuables and buried them to keep them safe. I covered the Acadian expulsion in an episode from late 2022, so be sure to check it out. In both versions of the Headless Nun story, the result is Sister Mary lost her head. While her body was returned to France, her head remained in the forest to slowly decay over the years. Like the Headless Brakeman in St. Louis, Saskatchewan, Sister Mary walks the forests of the area looking for her missing head. Over the past 250 years, many people have reported seeing her ghost and felt her presence in the foreboding forest. One man stated he was touched on the back by Sister Mary, and in that spot, 3 patches of thick white hair began to grow. A few people have even said they've been confronted by the Headless Nun, who asks them for help to find her head. But in some versions of the story, she's found her head and now wanders around the forest holding it. Now, let's slow things down a bit after 2 relatively graphic stories and head to Alberta, where another ghost nun enjoys picking berries and a priest watches over his fort home. Back in the early 2010s, I used to live in a place called Fairview. It's a small community located 1 hour north of Grande Prairie in northern Alberta. I enjoyed living there, not just because it was a quiet place, but because of a very beautiful area nearby. About 20 minutes south of Fairview is the Peace River and the Dunvegan Bridge. A beautiful suspension bridge painted yellow, it opened in 1960 and is one of the most photographed bridges in the province. Next to the bridge is Fort Dunvegan. This fort, built in 1805, was an important fur trading fort for several decades. Today it's a National Historic Site, but the fort buildings you see there are now mostly recreations of the original buildings. One of the few older buildings is the Factor's House, which was built in 1878, and it's the oldest extant dwelling in northern Alberta. It is the fort and the bridge that are to be our next 2 haunted locations. At the fort, there's stories of a ghostly priest who can be found sitting at his desk in the rectory. Some visitors have stated that he will stand and look out the window of that rectory. Visitors have said they get the feeling of being watched as they tour the buildings. But the priest isn't the only ghost in the area. In the 1960s, 2 men were driving over the Dunvegan Bridge when they saw a woman standing on the bridge in a snowstorm. They quickly got out of their car and rushed to the woman. They described her as having her head bent, wearing a cloak with bare feet. As they approached, she suddenly disappeared out of sight. Where she once stood, there were no footprints in the snow. For weeks on end, the men continued to return to the bridge to see if she appeared again. One day they saw her on a nearby hill standing knee-high in the snow, picking berries. Today she's known as the Grey Lady of Dunvegan Valley. As for who she truly was, the theory is she was a woman who either froze to death while searching for her husband in a snowstorm, but some believe she was a nun because of her cloak, who still wanders the area like the priest who watches Fort Dunvegan from his rectory. Let's stay in Alberta for our next story, and one which I have a bit of a story myself. In Edmonton at Fort Edmonton Park, there's the Firkins House. It's an unassuming house on 1905 Street in the Living History Park. You can walk by it without ever thinking there was anything unusual about it. But according to many people, it is one of the most haunted places in the entire city. The house dates to about 1911 when it was the home to Ashley and Blanche Firkins. Ashley had recently graduated from Northwestern University Dental School. Shortly after he and Blanche married, they moved to the booming community of Edmonton. The couple bought their plot of land around October 1911, and construction began on their $2,500 house around Christmas of that same year. The house was completed in the summer of 1912, and the family moved in shortly afterwards. The Firkins family, which grew to include 2 daughters, Carolyn and Miriam, lived in their home for a decade. At the house, Blanche hosted teas on the first Tuesday of every month, and while she entertained visitors, Ashley worked at his dental office, played golf and curling. He helped found the Granite Curling and Mayfair Golf and Country Clubs. But in late 1923, the family moved away to California. A decade later, on March 10, 1933, Ashley Firkins was killed in the Long Beach earthquake when the building he had a dental office in collapsed on top of him. After the Firkins family left Edmonton, the home had several tenants, including 3 university professors in a row at one point. In 1992, it was offered free of charge by Rod and Audrey Carpets to the Fort Edmonton Historical Foundation. The home was then moved to Fort Edmonton Park on August 27, 1992. It then went through renovations and opened to the public for the first time in May 1998. One of the first stories about anything going on in the house relates to the workers who were restoring the home following the move to Fort Edmonton Park. Workers reported that they experienced strange feelings in the house as if somebody was watching them. They also stated the tools they left in a certain spot overnight would be moved or misplaced completely. And over time, the stories have only grown. In the first season of the show Creepy Canada, the house was featured as a subject. It included the story of a local radio personality who decided to stay in the house overnight but fled before the sun came up. With the airing of that episode, more stories have appeared around the hauntings of the house. Other people have reported a sickly child in one room and a woman floating near a bookcase. There are also stories of a father who murdered his son in the house and now the son haunts the house, but there's no evidence of a murder taking place in the house. Other ghost stories tell of a family who died of tuberculosis in the house, but again, there's no record of people suffering from TB in the house. Katie Carpets, who lived in the house with her parents before it moved to Fort Edmonton Park, said most of the stories related to the hauntings are inaccurate. But she did say it is indeed a haunted house. Growing up there, she reported the feeling of being hugged by something twice, and her mother saw a man sitting at the kitchen table who vanished into thin air suddenly. As for my own experience in that house, it was small but unusual. A few years ago, I was visiting Fort Edmonton Park and I was on the upper floor of that house. While I was walking back towards the stairs, I looked back to see one of the chains that goes across the door to a room jumping around as if someone was holding it and shaking it. The streetcars weren't running by, nor was the train nearby. None of the other chains across the doors were moving either. It was a very strange thing to see, even if it was just a little bit of a haunting. Chucky, Annabelle, Mandy. Chucky is fictional, but Annabelle and Mandy are all too real. Annabelle is in the United States, but if you want to see Canada's own haunted doll, Mandy is available for viewing at the Quesnel Museum and Archives in British Columbia. Called Canada's most evil antique, Mandy is a children's doll dating back over 100 years. Originally a gift from a grandmother to her granddaughter, the doll was locked away in a trunk for many years before the granddaughter eventually took it to the museum to donate it. She wanted it preserved, but she didn't want to have it in her home anymore. Along with the uneasy feeling the doll gave her, she stated she often heard a baby crying in the night when there were no children in the house. The sound came up from the basement where the doll was kept and was so loud it couldn't be ignored. Once she gave the doll to the museum, the crying in her home stopped completely. Mandy was now the museum's problem, and she made her presence known immediately. The day she arrived in the museum, staff photographed her as part of the archives. That night, she was left on a counter while the museum was closed. When the staff arrived the next day, they found the entire area in disarray, as if a child had thrown a massive tantrum. During the day, lunches disappeared from the fridge, only to be found later in a drawer. It wasn't just lunches that started to go missing once Mandy became part of the museum's collection. Pens, books, and display items all disappeared. Some were found elsewhere in the museum, others have never been found. Visitors to the museum have said that the eyes of Mandy follow them as they move around the museum. If you want to get a picture of her, you may also be out of luck. Numerous visitors have reported that the batteries of their cameras and phones drain completely when in the presence of the doll. One visitor from Calgary tried to videotape Mandy, but he had no success in making the video camera work. Yet, when he went to other parts of the museum, he had no problem filming. A reporter was in the basement lab of the museum, developing some photos of Mandy. He was alone in the building, but suddenly heard footsteps upstairs. Then his contact sheet jammed in the machine, something that had never happened before. Mandy even haunts people who visit the museum when they get home. One visitor from Surrey stated that when she returned home from the museum, her house had been broken into, but the only item stolen was a porcelain doll. Speaking of dolls, Mandy is in place with the other dolls because she apparently doesn't like being with the dolls and lashes out at them at night. I don't know about you, but I plan to stay as far away from Mandy the doll as I possibly can. In Rankin Inlet, a settlement in Nunavut, there is the fire hall that has a long history of hauntings. People have reported footsteps running down the hall and shadowy figures standing in the dark looking out on the community. One spirit has a fondness for gloves and often takes them from where they were left only to put the items somewhere else in the building. Another ghost wanders up and down the stairs to a room that is currently used for storage but was once the chief's office. A little girl spirit has also been reported in the building, hovering around the vehicles. Perhaps the most unsettling specter of all is a man, all in black, who wanders the building, staying in the shadows and scaring the hell out of anyone who happens to see him. And while all these ghosts do appear scary, the people who work in the fire hall say that none of them appear to be malevolent. They just seem to be hanging around. And I have one more creepy story for you, about a place that has earned an unfortunate moniker of the Headless Valley. To finish off the story of the creepy places in Canada, I'm going to take you to the Northwest Territories, to the Nahanni National Park Reserve. This is a beautiful area of Canada that the Dene people have called home for at least 9,000 years. For centuries, they followed the caribou into the area, hunting them in the valley and harvesting resources from the Mackenzie River. There's another name for the area, the Headless Valley. When the Klondike Gold Rush hit, prospectors took many different ways to get to the Yukon. One way was along the Nahanni River through the Northwest Territories. This river went right through a valley. In the summer of 1897, about 766 prospectors traveled from Edmonton on the all-Canadian route, and of those, only a handful went through the South Nahanni River route. Only 2 men are known to have completed that route. Then in 1908, Willie and Frank McLeod went into the valley to find gold and were never heard from again. It would be 2 years later that their bodies were found, both without their heads. Today, the lost McLeod mine has become a legend unto itself, and it's believed as many as 20 people have lost their lives searching for the mine. Also with the men was a Scottish engineer who was never seen again. Speaking of stories of lost gold, check out my episode about the Lost Lemon Mine from late 2022, and the podcast Dead Man's Curse, Slumach's Gold, also on the Curious Cast Network. Martin Jorgensen went into the valley in 1917, also looking for gold. He sent out letters stating he found gold, but then his cabin burned to the ground. His body was found in the ashes, without its head. Explorer Raymond Patterson set out from the Fort Smith area in the 1920s to explore the region and was told men vanish in the country, and down the river they say it's a damn good country to keep clear of. In 1922, John O'Brien, a First World War veteran, was found hunched over a pile of timber with a matchbook in his hand, as if he died suddenly, lighting a fire. In 1945, another miner, this one coming from Ontario, came to the valley. When his body was found in a sleeping bag, his head was missing. There are also numerous RCMP reports that show many have vanished in the park, and there have even been a few unexplained plane crashes. So what's going on here? Well, no one knows, but it is a terrain for only the experienced traveler, and it's likely many have simply fallen prey to the elements and the landscape itself. Some say that an evil spirit haunts the valley and that shrieks can be heard in the valley at night. Others state that hairy giants live in caves in the canyon walls, led by a pale-skinned woman. According to the Dene, the land was inhabited by the Naha once, who were ferocious warriors that frequently raided Dene settlements along the Mackenzie and Lair rivers. After several attacks, a party of Dene warriors went into the Nahanni country and planned to pillage a Naha camp. As they approached a series of Naha structures, they found that the Naha were nowhere to be found. They had simply vanished. According to the Dene, the Naha were never seen again. Those are just some of the many tales of the eerie things from across Canada. So good luck sleeping tonight. And if you want more ghost stories from across the country and beyond, I encourage you to listen to Haunted Canada, a new show that just debuted on the Curious Cast Network. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.